Okay, welcome. This and that information. This week, we're going to look at Enrique Dussel on Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, which I introduced yesterday, actually, during Weekly Marx. Uh, I showed most of his sort of figures diagrams, which for those more idiographically interested, I think were actually very useful. And the text is Towards an Unknown Marx, a commentary on the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. It's translated and from the Spanish and edited with an introduction by Fred Mosley. We were looking before at Fred Mosley and Ben Folk's translation of the manuscripts of 64 to 65. And I think as I've shown, you can see that there is continuity among these documents, not quite as fragmented as we might think of, uh, of Marx's work. Note, of course, that it is a system of writings and that they come back in other texts, that is, theories of surplus value, among other things, and with various topics. So we went through the diagrams yesterday, and I urge you to take a moment to sort of look at those things. They allow us, I think, the cells diagrams are as good as any in terms of relating what others have tried to do but don't do, and that is relate living labor and value and work through the theory of the labor theory of value, or the theory of value involving labor, to the larger project, which is not necessarily to determine the question of labor, which is obviously important and important relative to um, the revolutionary task at hand in the 19th century, but also to help identify in an abstract way um, the larger project, which is to create a better means of analysis for political economy, that is the critique of political economy. And while assuming in a very easy way, that labor was the key, there were other keys, fertility, for example, and land fertility, that is, and other kinds of ways in which we can analyze capital. So all those matters are at work. Um, and needless to say, capital is the larger project. Surplus value is the means by which we get at that larger project. Um, the way in which we can see that looking at the whole thing and how labor is engaged in that, and we've spent the last couple of weeks thinking about subsumption, that is how individual laborers, by means of subsumption, that is by cooperation or integration, um, communication, we get social divisions of labor, we get ultimately real subsumption, and that is the relationship to technology, which is important to Marx in the 19th century, as it still is. Um, I would assert that various forms of various lines of thought related to Marx's thought have pursued a variety of things. The technological transformation, the determinacy in some ways of that kind of modern idea. Note, of course, that a considerable amount of ink has been spilled relating um, modernity to both technology and some new consciousness of that modernity, which is, I think, really important, a historical consciousness, needless to say. And all that is at work within the context of the 20th century, much to our distress and to our reality. And we can see that many lives were lost in some ways in pursuit of some of those kinds of goals, whether technologically or ideologically. So that's at work. And why look at Marx again? Well, because we need to sort of, not in sort of an inerrant way, but rather to consider that some of the folks who some of the folks who take it in an abstract way, that is, in relationship to the kind of foundational elements of Marxist thought that that he was trying to pursue not simply the technological element, but a variety of other elements. Needless to say, labor is part of it. Soil certainly is part of it. And then, of course, capital in its most abstract form as the kind of way in which you can organize all of these kinds of thoughts. And so that was what was going on. Needless to say, Marx was distracted by other matters, actual reality, history, his family, all those kinds of things. Needless to say, his relationship with Engels is really important. And in an age then with limited social media, he was engaged in a life that fully tackled the idea of history. So much so that there's a even a separate book now on his relationship to America, which I think is important for Americans certainly, but for just thinking about how all these peripheral elements relate. Needless to say, certain concepts are worth pursuing in a more interesting way and finding not only sorting out the theoretical elements, but also getting to an empirical kind of position at some point. So and the things that I'm kind of fiddling around with, rent is one way of getting at that, albeit separated from the idea of or from the reality of labor, more connected to the abstract version of what labor is, which is not to be meant to be, separated from the real lived labor, because that's really all we're left with, isn't it? But rather um, to to provide a way in which we can talk about how exploitation operates and how it can operate in both concrete and abstract ways. Concrete in terms of labor or capacity of labor, and also with the idea of a capacity of capital, which of which rent is a part, both in an absolute and relative way. And so, at some moment, we're going to look at new relationships, possible relationships among new kind of categories, and the category question is something that has some Marxists have pursued, and so now we have many capitals, as Marx says, and we are trying to work through that. And um, Dussel, I think, gives us one view of it, and it's not the last view or the definitive view, but it is a view that is useful for us in terms of developing other kinds of thinking about capital, um, not simply at the handicraft workshop way, although you could say, and I'm not going to argue it here, is, those of us who have computers, um, and now even laptop computers, we're kind of working in our own little handicraft workshops and in the context of social media. And things are being manufactured and they are being quote unquote industrialized. And it fits into an entire administrative or command element or control element that is a feature of post World War II Marxist thought. So I think that all connects, and it connects in ways that are useful for, as they say, revolutionary subjectivity, whatever that might be. So without further ado, and needless to say, Dussels thought a lot about this, and you can see that he's tried to put all this in a way that is worth thinking about, and within the particular context of only one part of Marxist thought, the economic manuscripts of 63 to 65, which it doesn't have everything there, but it certainly has a significant amount. And if you make a comparison between the manuscripts of 61 to 63 with the manuscripts of 63 to 64, you can see that much of that is kind of crystallized in 63, 65 that manifests itself in 64, 65 relative to rent particularly. So on the one hand, nothing new is being created. On the other hand, we can see that our thinking about this needs to look at all of those elements that ultimately wind up kind of pushed forward into the, for example, just as one of many examples, because it's not the definitive example, of theories of surplus value. And I think it is that particular place where some of those elements become important, ones which impinge upon eco-socialism, among many other things. So I would assert that that's kind of the research path that one needs to take. In other words, 61, 63 is more foundational in that sense. 64, 65 is trying to get to the details. But the core of things like theories of surplus value, pre-Kautsky, I would assert, but we don't have a good sense of that, although I think we should, and at some moment we shall, I would assert. And I hope that that's a kind of a worthy kind of pursuit. So what we're going to look at for the moment is chapter 7 of Dussel, and try and get through that because it is a pointer towards, now this doesn't, you know, should not dissuade us from completing the entire reading of Dussel, because obviously he has a particular handle on this that is worthwhile. And note, of course, that other people make commentaries on Dussel, and note that, you know, that doesn't quite reach where perhaps some of us want to go. And so needless to say, this is only part of the process. Chapter 7, Dussel's Unknown Marx, the Theory of Rent, notebooks 10 to 12, pages 445 to 636, from June to August of 1862. And this is from the MECW, which, of course, has been augmented, amplified by the MEGA. So anyway, we'll get to that eventually. It's no longer a question of explaining how it comes about that the price of a commodity yields rent as well as profit, thus apparently evading the general law of value. And by raising its price above its intrinsic surplus value, carrying more than the general rate of profit for a given capital. The question is, why? In the process of equalization of commodities at average prices, this particular commodity does not have to pass on to other commodities so much of its intrinsic surplus value that it only yields the average profit, but is able to realize a portion of its own surplus value, which forms an excess over and above average profit, so that it is possible for a farmer the private ownership of lands, mines, water, etc., by certain people, which enables them to snatch, intercept, and seize the excess surplus value over and above profit, average profit, the rate of profit determined by the general rate of profit, page 271, Marx. First of all, we will comment on why Marx was interested in the subject of rent. It was precisely a matter of explaining a phenomenon on the superficial level that, according to many, annulled the law of value. Footnote 1. Thus, Marx wrote to Engels in a letter dated 9 August 1862, quote, all I have to prove theoretically is the possibility of absolute rent without infringing the law of value. This is the point round which the theoretical controversy has revolved from the time of the physiocrats until the present day. Ricardo denies that possibility. I maintain it. I likewise maintain that his denial rests on a theoretically false dogma deriving from Adam Smith, the supposed identity of cost prices and values of commodities. And that is the crux of it, and at least from a Dussel point of view, is cost price versus values of commodity, which obviously leaves itself available, at least at one level, to questions of both qualitative and quantitative analysis. In this case, Marx is interested in defending the law of value because what matters is the labor objectified in value, living labor, the human being itself. It is a fundamental ethical question. Not even rent is an exception to the law of value that everything, surplus value, price, and profit, is ultimately founded on human living labor. His inalienable dignity is still the rule. Hence, it was important to derive rent from surplus value and to build the necessary categories to establish the mediations in order to explain this phenomenon. Absolute rent by itself would not deserve such an extended treatment because historically it can disappear when the organic composition of capital in agriculture is equal to that of non-agricultural industry. However, it is a good example, as Marx mentions in a letter of Engels dated 2 August 1862, to illustrate the theory of surplus value, which is the matter in question now from the perspective of competition and of monopoly. On the other hand, this is the beginning of the confrontation with Ricardo. Finally, with Smith, Marx had approached the whole problematic of reproduction from production at the material level in the relationship of capital to capital. Rent, instead, is a third source of revenue, a capital revenue relationship. And thus, the production cost problematic is abandoned and advanced to a more superficial level. Now, remember, superficial is not superfluous, right? In this sense, more superficial level, namely the sphere of circulation of average profit production cost. Now, we should go from the question of rent in Robertus and the Ricardian law, section 7.1 and 7.2, to the question of the cost price, 7.3, to end with the problem of rent in Ricardo 7.4 and Smith 7.5, Marx's continuous interlocutors. Note, of course, that cost price has, on the one hand, one concept within the 19th century, and as many have contributed to the notion of cost price, it expands or perhaps laterally moves in the 20th century. So this is this back to Dussel. This is the central moment of all the manuscripts of 1861 to 63, thanks to Johann Robertus, 1805 to 75, the German Ricardian socialist whose Sozialbrief von Kirchmann Dritter brief of 1851 Marx confronts here, as well as thanks to Proudhon and his theory of money, Marx was able to build his theory of value. Now, the assiduous scholar in London can, in the middle of anguish and real misery, discover his theory of average profit and the price of production starting from rent. 7.1, formulation of a theory of rent through a critical confrontation with Robertus. As in the beginning of Grundrisse, where he confronts Proudhon, Marx starts to warm up the machine with comings and goings without a fixed destiny. He then enters into the question of wages using categories such as average wages and average price. In agriculture, wages would be lower than in industry, the same as Austria in relation to England. Here, Marx raises a deep question. It is not about discovering differential rent by the diverse fertility of land, but by something deeper and based in labor. Quote, quite apart from the variation in rent according to the fertility of land, rent as such would already be possible. It could exist because the average wage of the agricultural laborer is below that of the industrial worker. Page 252. To speak of possibility is to look for the essence, this Dussel. To speak of possibility, footnote 3, is to look for the essence, the fundament of rent. Just as relative surplus value could be understood from the increase of productive force of capital, and thus eluding the question of being as absolute surplus value, non-paid labor in the same way, Marx had to define as absolute rent in its possibility, in general, rent as surplus value. That is, as non-paid labor in order to discover subsequent differences of land based on higher productivity and other natural characteristics of the land, that is, in differential rent. His first provisional solution is then the following, quote, this is Marx, here then, we have already the possibility rent, since, in fact, the agricultural worker's wage does not equal the average wage. This is rent, this is rent, would be feasible quite independent of the price of the product, which is equal to its value, page 252. For now, back to Dussel, for now, the argument is incomplete, but we can immediately see the effect that the reading of Robertus had on Marx, which suggested to him, although with mistakes, the solution of the problem accomplished here for the first time in his life. Page 260, quote Marx, Mr. Robertus seems to think that competition brings about a normal profit or average profit. Now, Marx names this concept for the first time in his theoretical life and with consciousness of building a category. This is page 260. Close quote. We enter then into another universe, another phenomenological level. We've left behind the 9 first notebooks and have entered into the level of the future book 3 of Capital, the text. Competition as the level of abstraction within which many of the essential categories of Marx's thought the thought of Marx will be built for the first time. Competition was the second part of Marx's program in the treatment of capital in general. Footnote 4. Competition is the movement of the totality of capital within which prices are leveled, equalized, and so on an average level is produced in all branches of production. Located, thanks to Robertus, at this exact level, Marx moves to a creative discourse that reminds us of that moment in Grundrisse that led him to the discovery of surplus value. Footnote 5. Marx has left behind the question of average wages, with which he started, and uses Robertus's suggestion that the price of commodity A rises above its value. Also on page 260. It does not matter if Marx rejects the argument of his compatriot. The truth is that Marx has found the problem well situated. For this reason, Robertus deserves a place in history like Proudhon with the question of money. First of all, Marx rejects the idea that the average price is equal to the value. The average profit in a particular sphere, therefore, also is equal to the general rate of profit, because average price might be different from value, and also average profit and surplus value. And the average rate of profit of a branch or sphere of production may not coincide with the general average rate of profit of all branches. All this is understood now from competition, the ontological level of construction of the world of commodities. Competition among capitals thus seeks to treat every capital, this quote, competition among capitals thus seeks to treat every capital as a share of the total capital and correspondingly to regulate its participation in surplus value and hence also in profit. Competition, plus ou moins, plus or less, plus or minus, succeeds in this by means of its equalization. Competition achieves this equalization by regulating average prices. These average prices themselves, however, are either above or below the value of the commodities, so that no commodity yields a higher rate of profit than any other. It is therefore wrong to say the competition among capitals brings about a general rate of profit by equalizing the price of commodities to their values. On the contrary, it does so by converting the values of the commodities into average prices, in which a part of surplus value is transferred from one commodity to another. Close quote, page 64, footnote 7. However, Dussel However, Marx imagines a sphere of production where there is an impediment to competition. And because of this reason, the average price, which in this case would be under its value, is not respected and increases until it is equal to the immanent value. This terminology of Robertian influence is new in Marx. It shows a denominative indecision, that is, a creative moment in Marx's categorical discourse. And I think this is important. And, we might go to Shake to get a kind of frame around that in a more quantitative way. Anyway, back to Dussel. There could be three cases, one in which average price is superior to the immanent value. Average price is superior to the immanent value, one in which it is inferior, and one in which it is equal. So, three cases. The case of absolute rent is analogous to the second, in which its intrinsic surplus value is higher than the surplus value realized in its average price. Let us now reread carefully the text placed at the beginning of this chapter 7. There are still two questions left to explain. Why is the value of the agricultural product greater than the industrial product? And how is it possible for the agricultural capitalist to realize the excess over the general average profit in order to recover all its surplus value without transferring it to other commodities or branches? See figure 7.1. As for the first issue, Marx has to prove the opposite of the way he started. If agricultural wages are lower but have the same organic composition, the product has less value and then rent could be extracted. Now, Marx contends that in agriculture there is a lower organic composition of capital, and therefore agricultural products have a higher value than industrial products produced under the same conditions except for its organic composition. There seems to be a contradiction there, right? So let's look at 7.1. This is absolute rent, surplus profit realized over average profit. And so we're looking at the immanent value of the product and the average as relatively equivalent to the average price of the agricultural product. And we look at the composition of rent, the average profit, the surplus value, necessary labor, component part of value, the necessary labor and the component part of value as part of production cost, and the combination of average price, if determined by the general average profit, as being quote unquote equivalent to rent. So, explanation numbers 1, 2 indicate hypothetical amounts of value with a purely pedagogical purpose. We have respected Marx's names for the time being without anticipating further precisions and without clarifying his ambiguities. Needless to say, yes, there are plenty of ambiguities. So, one has to prove, Marx writes consciously, about a problem that has not yet been resolved, that agriculture belongs to those particular spheres of production whose commodity values are above their average price. This point appears, footnote 8, certain to apply to agriculture on an average because manual labor is still relatively dominant in it, and it's characteristic of the bourgeois mode of production to develop manufacture more rapidly than agriculture. This is, however, a historical difference which can disappear. This is, however, a historical difference which can disappear. That is some assumption of the transformation of technology, etc. Page, close quote, page 326. Marx answers the second issue, stating that the private ownership of land, that is, mines or water by certain people, enables them to snatch, intercept, and seize the exact surplus value over and above average profit. Page 271. However, it is the farmer or agricultural capitalist who must accomplish the excess of their price over their production costs. Page 274. footnote 9, and who imposes this price thanks to a suspension of competition by means of monopoly founded, of course, on the private property of land. One might indicate, sort of, for example, I'm breaking here for a second, the history of the California water product and its relation to agribusiness in the Central Valley, for example. Oh, back to, quote, Marx. So the monopoly of land ownership enables the landed proprietor to squeeze that part of surplus labor from the capitalist, which would form a constant excess profit. But those who derive rent from monopoly are mistaken when they imagine that monopoly enables the landed proprietor to force the price of commodity above its average price, to sell the commodity not above, but at its value. Close quote. Pages 326 to 7. The essential back to Dussel. The essential question was then to justify the existence of absolute rent. This is necessary because capital demands before itself the existence of the poor. Footnote 10, namely to confront the labor as someone else's property and make him into a wage laborer. Page 278. Capital needs to snatch from peasants their traditional means of survival, and land is the basis for their subsistence. Quote, Marx, its only requirement is that land should not be common property, that it should confront the working classes as conditions of production not belonging to it. Page 278, close quote. Back to Dussel. For the industrial capitalist, the landlord is then an additional necessity as the enforcer of the non-possession by living labor of its means of subsistence. It is clear that the radical bourgeois would like to eliminate it and grant property of land to the state, but does not do so because it would be dangerous for the other form of property. Page 278, footnote 11. This is a capitalistic way to justify absolute rent. As for differential rent due to the diverse fertility of the land, Ricardo seemed to be right, but was essentially wrong regarding its foundation. Quote, modified in this way, the proposition is correct. It explains the existence of rent, whereas Ricardo only explains the existence of different rents and actually does not credit the ownership of land with any economic effect. So we're seeing the distinguishing of course, landed property, etc., from other forms of property, and as well, obviously, the class difference of footnote 12, close quote, page 327. Back to Dussel. Other issues discussed in the text can be read without any difficulty of interpretation. Marx indicates as a methodological suggestion that Robertus intuitively surmises the difference between surplus value and its special forms. But in the question of rent, Robertus misses the point because right from the beginning is concerned with the explanation of a particular phenomenon, that is ground rent, and not with the establishment of a general law, page 296. Namely, intuition comes before concept. The forms of appearance are phenomena, but it is necessary to discover the essence, the general law, by another form of manifestation, that is, absolute rent phenomenon from surplus value essence. So I hope you can see what's going on here, methodologically speaking, and how Marx brings to looking at Robertus in that way to try and refine the category. So, methodological digression, subsection 7.2, chapter 7, right? We wish to step ahead from Marx's own diachronical historical discourse in order to allow the reader of manuscripts of 1861 to 63 an accurate, precise, clear epistemological attention. Usually, no importance is given to the name, that is, the denomination of categories, and this is a mistake made even by the editors of MEGA 2-3, who in the index to volume 7 sometimes mislead the readers with their references. maybe the best example of this is the category whose concept or semantic content is the value expressed in the sum of production prices or cost price, that is, the component parts of the constant capital plus variable capital and average profit. In capital, the text, it will be called price of production. Footnote 13, and we are at figure 7.2. Quote, one has to prove, Marx writes consciously about a problem that has not yet been resolved, that agriculture belongs to those particular spheres of production whose commodity values are above their average price. This point appears certain to apply to agriculture on an average because manual labor is still relatively dominant in it and is characteristic of the bourgeois mode of production. To develop manufacture more rapidly than agriculture, this is, however, a historical difference which can disappear. So, anyway, back to 7.2. Maybe the best example of this is the category whose concept or semantic content is the value expressed in the sum of production costs or cost price, the component parts of the constant capital plus variable capital and average profit. In capital, it'd be called price of production. And so you can see in figure 7.2, value, market value, market price, the relation of market value to market price, value sort of outside of or above, but at the kind of border of market price and market value. And we get cost price, which is, as we know, the cost of production and the price of production. And the cost price is this intermediate idea, the cost of doing business, as we might say, among other things. But uh, this is a position that is actually important, and of course, with the evolution, as they say, of accounting, history of accounting, we need to sort of look at that as well. Production's price in these manuscripts, footnote 13. Marx hesitated, however. He was unsure for a long time about the names of his categories. Now, this is not a terminological question, but a semantic problem. In fact, at the beginning is no conceptual clarity. Namely, he has not clearly separated the noetic content and thus has still not decided what name to adopt for each moment of the concept or precis from precidere in Latin, to distinguish cut, sever category or precise category. When the final term or word names a specific or a specified concept, when the final term or word names a clearly specific concept or specified concept, only at this moment a category has been finally constructed. In fact, price of production appears for the first time in footnote 15, our chapter 10, explicitly separated from cost price, arrow 5 of figure 7.2, as you can see above. Profit, and therefore the difference between price of production and cost price, appears to him as a surplus over the cost price only as regards his own commodity. Close quote. Footnote 14. It's from the MECW. Only at this moment is price of production distinguished precisely from production cost. Furthermore, names of new categories appear, such as market value, market price, in addition to the already analyzed average profit. Let me break here for a moment and ask the general question of the relation of transaction cost to this, and we'll get back to that. Back to Dussel. The denomination production cost has been discussed from the beginning of these manuscripts. The passage arrow 4 to cost price is performed now only in notebook 11, footnote 15, although its concept has been enunciated sometime before. Here, the average price, that i.e., that formed by the production cost, plus the average profit, coincides with the market price of the product, which hopefully seems obvious. In light of such epistemological attention, we shall see the new categories which appear in these pages. Quote, back to Marx, in competition, there are two distinct moments towards equalization. Capitals within the same sphere of production equalize the prices of the commodities produced within this sphere to the same market price. The average market price value should equal the value of the commodity, were it not for the equalization between different spheres of production. As between these different spheres, competition equalizes the values to the average prices insofar as the reciprocal interaction of the capitals is not hampered by a third element, that is, land ownership, etc. Close quote, MECW, 31:356. As one can see, the new category, market price, which appeared for the first time long before footnote 16, is slowly being distinguished from the much broader concept of average price. Footnote 17, at a more superficial level, as a more concrete price, and within the same branch. He has not yet clearly discovered the concept of market value, but a few pages later, we see it differentiated. That is, quote Marx, this common value is the market value of these commodities, the value at which they appear on the market. Expressed in money, this market value is the market price. The actual market price is now below this market value, and coincides with it only by chance. It can be said that the average of the actual market price is the market price, which represents the market value. This is 429 in the MECW, close quote. So then, the fundamental relation of market value with respect to market price, arrow 6 of figure 7.2, is one of the many possibilities among these newly constructed categories. We have thus indicated only a few of the new categories in order to assist with the reading. Let us now return to our commentary. Subsection 7.3. So there's a little methodological aside, but actually it's very, is really worth it. Subsection 7.3, the Ricardian Law of Rent and its History, the MECW 31, pages 344 to 86. Marx starts by confronting James Anderson's theory, especially in his work, Essays Relating to Agricultural and Rural Affairs, volumes 1 to 3 of 1775 to 96, but also considers other works regarding the corn crisis. Our philosopher and economist comments, quote, with a correct conception of rent, the first point to arise was, of course, that it does not originate from the land, but from the product of agriculture, that is, from labor, from the price of the product of labor, from the value of the agricultural product, from the labor applied to the land, not from the land. Close quote, page 372. Marx says that what Anderson calls the value of the whole produce is evidently nothing other than his conception of the market price at which the product is sold. And he concludes, quote, Marx does, with Anderson, rent equals the excess of the market price of the product over its average price. Quote, page 373. In one of his terms, that is market price, Marx has already more clarity than in his earlier initial descriptions. See in 7.1 concepts such as imminent value in relation to average price. However, there is still an ambiguous average price, which later on shall be price of production. If Marx has a positive judgment of Anderson, in contrast, he is too negative, too harsh towards Thomas Robert Malthus. In this case, toward his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Progress of Rent, Malthus on Rent, 1815. Marx compared Malthus to Ricardo, who, according to Marx, was serious, scientific, and honest. In a famous epistemological passage, quote, when a man seeks to accommodate science to a viewpoint which is derived not from science itself, however erroneous it may be, but from outside, from alien external interests, then I call him base. Close quote, page 349. There are 4 excellent pages, that is 346 to 50, which show Marx's disgust with Malthus and his great respect for Ricardo. More Dussel, a confrontation with Wilhelm G.F. Roscher of 1817 to 94 in his Grundlage der Nationalökonomie, 1858, allows Marx to raise the point that in many cases, theories are appearances under which an interest struggle in many cases, theories are appearances under which an interest struggle hides under their surface. Page 351. Marx is very much aware of the identification of a scholar with a class faction. Malthus or Roscher with the landlord's oligarchy, Ricardo with industrial capitalism. If he had to choose, Marx would favor the latter. Once again, Marx criticizes Robertus and shows that, in fact, he has not understood Ricardo. That is, Ricardo thus defined rent, quoting Ricardo here, quote, rent is that portion of the produce of the earth which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. When in the progress of society, land of the second degree of fertility is taken into cultivation, rent immediately commences on that of the first quality, and the amount of that rent will depend on the difference in the quality of these 2 portions of land, quote, quote, Ricardo. And Marx objects. That is, Marx says, quote, Ricardo abstracts from the question of absolute rent, which he denies on theoretical grounds, because he starts out from the false assumption that if the value of commodities is determined by labor time, the average prices of commodities must equal their values, which is why he comes to the wrong practical conclusion that if values of commodities and average prices of commodities were identical, then absolute rent. If, on the other hand, one knows that average prices and values are not identical, that the average price of a commodity may be either equal to its value or greater or lesser, then the problem itself disappears, and with it, also the hypotheses for its solution. Close quote, pages 358 to 60. Now, average price is here what he later calls price of production. Remember that. And for the time being, cost price if it includes average profit. But it can also be market price if it includes rent, if you haven't gotten confused so far. Thus, it is ambiguous. It is an ambiguous concept which shows Marx elaborating or constructing historically, genetically, progressively. When a few pages later, he once again criticized the German pre-industrial Pomeranian, Bertus, who is not able to understand Smith or Ricardo because Ricardo's whole conception is only appropriate to the presupposition that the capitalist mode of production is the predominant one. Page 382. We also understand Roscher's position when he writes that nature as such has value, 361. This is the whole issue of the value of land. Let us skip a few pages and examine a recondite mystery. This is footnote 15, MECW 32, 486. Quote, the form of revenue and the sources of revenue are the most fetishistic expression of the relations of capitalist production. It is their form of existence as it appears on the surface, divorced from the hidden connections and the immediate connecting links. Thus, the land becomes the source of rent, capital the source of profit, and labor the source of wages. Close quote, page 449. Quote, this is still Marx, in this formula, in which rent, a part of surplus value, is represented in relation to a particular natural element independent of human labor. Not only the nature of surplus value is completely obliterated because the nature of value itself is obliterated, but just as the source of rent appears to be land, so now profit appears to be due to capital as a particular material instrument of production. Close quote, page 485. So Marx's reflection on this fetishization had already started in 1844, right? And it's also found in the Grundrisse. In Notebook 11, we read, quote, this is Marx, by original powers of the land, we understand here those which it possesses independently of the action of human industry, although on the other hand, the powers given to it by human industry become just as much its original powers as those given to it by the process of nature. Close quote, page 466. In Notebook 14, we find the best definition of the subject before Capital, the book Capital. Quote, this is Marx, the value of land is nothing but the price which is paid for capitalized rent. Close quote. MECW, volume 32, book 32, page 299, close quote. So, without going too far, there is a kind of indexicality at work here, right, between value of land and capitalized rent. Anyway, back to Dussel. In other words, land per se, like human labor per se for other reasons, has no value. But when it has been acquired or subsumed by capital as the non-property of living labor, it receives a rent. As a future payment of a rent, namely of a portion of surplus value distributed in the price of the product over and above production costs plus average profit, an exchange value is granted to it, which we could call extrinsic, i.e., fictitious. If there were no rent, as in the case of fixed capital, well, you could, but let's not go there. Then the value invested in the purchase of land would pass like other portions, aliquot parts to the value of the product. And this would be so not because land has a value, but because the land has been purchased with objectified labor, i.e., money. Labor capacity and exclusivity on the ownership of land are paid because it is a reservoir containing the use values which are to be got hold of through industry. MECW 31, page 466. Such a payment can be recovered either in rent or in the component portion of corresponding values. See figure 5.2, where the constant capital originally invested reappears, is reproduced. Where the constant capital originally invested reappears, is reproduced in the product. Still Dussel. In these pages, Marx approaches three more issues: the average price of wheat during a certain historical period, the difference between absolute and differential rent. In Thomas Hopkins, in his book Labor Defended Against the Claims of Capital of 1825, who deserved a special study due to his social position and the costs of breaking up new ground of soil, which become comprehensible after what has been commented. Subsection 7.4, which I will resume tomorrow, So we will look at 7.4 on cost price and a slightly more complex version of how categories and mediation is explicated. 7.5. Figure 7.4 on differential rent, which needs a lot of explaining. 7.6 on rent tables, which also is more complicated. And of course, we will get to some equations, which on the one hand are clear, on the other hand are worth a little bit more explication. And they are, and they will be, and that's how we will get to the end. We will get to the end of this section, and I added a section here on panel regression analysis only because I need to do that for my own notations. And also, there is a new book, Marx at the Frontiers, which gets to the real point that deal with not necessarily ground rents, but also other kinds of quote rent-like things, actually, and I would guess help explicate some of the problems that do exist, and perhaps can be sort of calculated without a lot of trouble from the 2008 financial crisis, which I'm hoping that these two folks will comment on in terms of getting a sense of how their panel regression analysis goes. Noting, of course, that we don't look at the large question of pattern regression, but rather comparisons made simply between the US and the UK. So that will be one observation. I don't know if we're going to get there. In fact, we may have to go back to Dussel and get another chapter in to explain a couple more of diagrams like 5.2, et cetera, et cetera. For example, I think we have it here. Yes, 5.2, the moments of the description of reproduction in Notebook 7, which it's all there. It's just a little easier in schematic form to look at what the income of the capitalist at one end and its relation to labor capacity, what happens after the capitalist hires labor, etc. All righty, so I'm done. What I will do here then now is stop